So I'm really pleased to introduce Mel Engman, who is one of our CARLA fellows. She's also a doctoral dissertation fellow in second language education. And her research interests include the use of heritage and indigenous languages in a variety of schooling contexts. And today she is going to be talking about reclaiming language, reframing expertise, heteroglossia in one teacher learner's Ojibwe language classroom. So please welcome Mel Engman.
Thanks, everyone. Buju, Mel Engman, Indigenous, Gawin and Dudu Damasin, Yinkichimu Komanakwe, Niga Gwega Kendan, Ojibwe Moyano Mag, Bega Kendasu Wigamegong, Nimin Wendan, Debaja Moyano Manongom. My name's Mel Engman. I'm here to talk to you today about my dissertation work with a teacher learner in an Ojibwe language classroom. I'm really happy to be here. And it's my sincere hope that this portrayal of the language and the participants and the context, that it conveys something to you that helps you better understand how language revitalization really actually has a lot to say to the field of applied linguistics. So let's talk about language revitalization. It's essentially a grassroots movement of reclamation and resistance that contests the hegemonies of English and other dominant majority languages by increasing the number of proficient speakers of an indigenous language. It's been called several different names, it's known by these different names, and it's much more than a straightforward linguistic endeavor. Indigenous language reclamation is a project of social justice and self-determination, and it's never just about language. So the living language that this project is concerned with is Ojibwe-Moan. This is the Algonquian language of the Anishinaabe people who are indigenous to land around and beyond the Great Lakes of Turtle Island. Few Anishinaabe in the land now occupied by the United States grew up speaking Ojibwe-Moan in the home because of longstanding policies of state-backed deculturalization. This includes forced relocation of entire communities and boarding schools that separated children from their families and attempted to erase their linguistic and cultural identities. Yet there are still several hundred bilingual elders or first speakers who remember and who remain. But they alone can't meet the current growing demand for Ojibwe language teachers. So this means that most teachers involved in Ojibwe language education are themselves language learners with varying levels of proficiency and pedagogical training. So Leanne Hinton refers to these language teachers as non-fluent teachers and teacher learners. The teacher in her language is, we all know in this self-selecting audience of CARLA Talk attendees, we know that the teacher and her language are of vital importance to the success of a classroom-based language program, and a lack of insight into the nature of a teacher-learner's classroom is an obstacle to providing teacher learners with the support they need and deserve. So let's think about what we can presume about a teacher of a more commonly taught language, say a middle school Spanish teacher. We can presume some formal language training, some formal pedagogical training, some language proficiency that's known, it's been assessed. The assessments have also been assessed and are fairly sound assessments. There's likely a baseline curriculum and they have easy access to authentic texts, real world language in use. The Ojibwe teacher learner in her classroom are vastly different. So the degree of formal language training and pedagogical training are really up for grabs. It depends on what they've had access to. Varying proficiencies among the population of teacher learners, and even if they have been assessed, those assessments themselves might be wholly unreliable. They may not show exactly what the teacher can and cannot do with language. They likely have to come up with their own sort of bootstraps curriculum, and there are very few authentic texts. So there's also a far-reaching colonial legacy of schooling against Ojibwe culture and language. And this is a situational irony that's not lost on anyone. We still know very little about how these historical, political, and material circumstances manifest in the ways teacher learners teach language, and we know little about the kind of teacher and learner languages that circulate in such a context. So I'm going to locate this study primarily in the field of Indigenous language reclamation, but my research questions grow from existing scholarship across areas of classroom talk and interaction, heteroglossia, and classroom discourse. At the heart of each of these areas, as with the heart of revitalization, is language. Language as a target of acquisition, language as a mediator of learning and social relationships, language as a cultural practice, and language as a reflection and reproduction of ideology. So I'm just going to do this real quick. We know from SLA research that classroom talk and interaction are significant sites of language learning. This scholarship helps us understand how teachers may rely on particular participant structures such as initiation, response, evaluation, or IRE sequences, or call and response. And they do this to organize classroom content, facilitate speaking opportunities, and provide corrective feedback. For instance, in a 2011 study of Kaska learners, Kaska is a language indigenous to the Yukon, Barbara Meek found that language learners' use of Kaska outside the classroom closely mimicked the IRE sequences that were a mainstay of classroom instruction. So this means the learners, they were learning their language in the classroom, but then they were speaking it with each other outside the classroom, which is great, except that the way they were speaking it was to play a game where they pointed at things in the immediate environment and named those things in Kaska. Heteroglossia comes from Mikhail Bakhtin. It's a means of describing the multi-voicedness of language in use. And in SLA research, we know heteroglossia through frames that represent flexible and complex language use, such as translanguaging or code meshing. Heteroglossia rejects monolingual conceptions of language, and it treats language as a social practice that relies on a communicator's individual linguistic and extra-linguistic repertoire. An example of this is Sheila Nicholas's 2011 study examining Hopi identity among English-dominant Hopi youth. She found that active participation and involvement in the cultural practices of Hopi shaped the identities of the youth in her study through extra-linguistic affective enculturation. We know from this work that language is more than code, and it's more than one medium. It includes things like behavior and affect. And then studies of classroom discourse offer salient points of intersection between the last two areas. Research on sociocultural talk and interaction overlaps with heteroglossia here. So the word discourse, it used to mean just any stretch of spoken or written language longer than like a single sentence. But now, with the work of new literacy studies theorists, a new meaning has arisen. It's often written with a big D, and it's decidedly more ideological. It refers to the shared and unshared understandings and roles taken on in the context of the classroom. So we know from research on classroom discourse that the wide variety of texts that can be written, spoken, drawn, enacted in a single classroom, they serve to orient a social actor relative to the worlds around them. So ideologies and experiences that originate outside the classroom are quite salient to the action that occurs inside the classroom. So it's important to note that language reclamation contexts are understudied and underrepresented in these bodies of literature. Furthermore, American Indian scholars, educators, and community members have criticized a certain degree of tone deafness in language research that fails to account for the unique situation of English-dominant Native people learning their language in a school. There are certainly conditions of difference that accompany the learning of an endangered language in terms of program objectives, motivation, and curricular materials. However, Indigenous language educators also cite things such as the damage and violence of settler colonialism as a point of difference, as well as a relationship with the language that transcends the psychological. So I was at a teacher training a few years ago when an elder took issue with the categorization of Ojibwe Moan as a second language. She said, Ojibwe is our first language, we're born with it. And the Ojibwe language teachers in that room nodded their approval. This distinction, one that's rarely clear to non-Indigenous researchers, is real and ever present to the speakers and learners in the classroom. So the elders comment that Anishinaabe are born with their language. It seems to ascribe a spiritual or even biological quality to the significance of the language. This represents a view of language that differs from the more psychological and sociocultural approaches that we in the academy tend to adhere to. So applying this view to a classroom context reimagines research around language learning into an almost epigenetic project of sorts. It registers the language as present, though perhaps latent, waiting to be switched on by an external stimulus. It requires an attention to the visible and invisible as symbiotic parts of a whole ecology. And so this is where I take a short but necessary digression into my own shifting epistemology. So before I dig into the methodology, I want to be clear about some epistemological tension that's come about in my work as I've been doing more and more of this. So Barbara Meek's quote right here rings true for many of us working in Indigenous and minoritized languages. Institutions may not appear all that interested in producing speakers of Indigenous languages, but they certainly are interested in the production of knowledge. But what kinds of knowledge and for whom are the questions that applied linguists have been asking ourselves a lot lately. Who has the power? So Native scholars such as Vine Deloria Jr. and Linda Tuhiwai Smith have been writing about the power inherent in this business of knowledge production for decades. And more recently, Eve Tuck and Wayne Young characterized inquiry as a sort of invasion that maintains settler colonial power differentials. So Tuck and Young point out that researchers, like me, have been known to call for the need to decolonize education, decolonize research methods, or decolonize student thinking. And as a language researcher and teacher, this is me, I do this. So I see decolonizing potential in reclaiming spaces for Indigenous language. It is important to assert, however, that true decolonization is realized physically and politically. It's the repatriation of land, and it's the assurance of the futurity of Indigenous life on and with that land. So Tuck and Young remind me that this truth of non-metaphorical decolonization is a really unsettling phenomenon, as it calls for the physical displacement of the settler and her systems. This is something that my white imagination struggles to envision. So let me be clear. My research does not literally decolonize. While I work to literally fill more space with the language that is indigenous to it, this is all happening within a colonial institution. I'm not returning stolen land. What I am doing is aiming to produce research that serves anti-colonial interests, in part for the chance to break free from the binary of colonized colonizer. But it's not always clear to me how to do this. So the interpretive lens I bring to the classroom spaces I'm engaged with now is one of a settler, but it's also one of a settler who rejects reconciliation with colonialism's incommensurability. So my epistemology here is one of uncertainty and belief. I'm not attempting to prove that an Indigenous person learning her Indigenous language later in life is engaging in a wholly different process than other second language endeavors. Rather, I'm just receiving and accepting all of the visible and invisible difference as part and parcel with the data. I default to it as the teachers must do in these contexts. So, I'd be happy, by the way, to talk about more of this with any of you during the Q&A. But let's move on now to the study. So, I'm going to describe the study specifics briefly and then show you some data. The research questions that guide this study grow from previous involvement with language documentation and materials development projects with Ojibwe language educators around Minnesota and Wisconsin. So my first question asks, what's the nature of language instruction, use, and interaction in a teacher-learner's Ojibwe language kindergarten? My second question asks, what ideologies are indexed in the language classroom? How are they indexed? And what roles do they play in the classroom space? So because of time constraints, I'm just going to focus on findings from that first research question today. So to answer these questions, I designed a participatory linguistic ethnography study of one classroom led by a highly respected and experienced teacher-learner who I called Jane. So linguistic ethnography is a newer method. It's not entirely solidified as a methodology in and of itself, but Rampton characterizes it as a sort of hybrid methodology of sociolinguistics and applied linguistic research, focusing on classrooms and language learning, and also critical approaches to discourse. So it draws on sociolinguistics more than anthropology, but it also places a heavier emphasis on cultural, social, and historical elements more than those microanalytic paradigms do, so I've paired it with critical discourse analysis as well. And this is a framework that reads language in use beyond its immediate ideational content. CDA helps us to see the social histories and ideologies that are indexed by language in any social context. And I relied on Van Leeuwen and Fairclough specifically in this regard. But I'm not going to talk too much about this today because we're not doing too much of it today. So here is a table describing my data sources, ethnographic forays into the classroom. It included participant observation, audio-video recordings, semi-structured focus group interviews, unstructured interviews and conversations with the teacher-learner. Context. I'm calling the school Migizi Wazasoning. It's a K-12 school where English is the language of instruction in every class. Language and culture class are separate, so English also dominates in culture class, but Ojibwe language is compulsory. So in the kindergarten class, there are 19 kindergartners, and there are a lot of adults. So there's one full-time kindergarten teacher, one full-time student teacher, 2 part-time teacher's aides, plus 1 full-time language teacher-learner. And these adults move in and out of the classroom to take care of various things. They might take a student to the office, come back, take a phone call, but many adults in the classroom at once. And when the Ojibwe language teacher is not teaching, when she's not instructing, the default language in the classroom is English. Okay. So the teacher-learner at the heart of this study is Jane. This is Jane. She's a bilingual Anishinaabe woman who's been teaching and working in language for decades. She's got little formal training in either language teaching or the language itself. She frequently requests Ojibwe-specific PD because she worries about her proficiency. But as a teacher learner, she's neither prototypical nor an outlier, because that's the thing about teacher learners. Each person has his or her own strengths and histories, and there are no givens. So note that the language of instruction at the school is English. So at Migizi-Wazasoning, it's not immersion. This is not an immersion school study, but it's also not really like a foreign language classroom where the students would go to a different classroom for their language class. She is in the classroom all the time. She is a push-in language resource for these students. So that means she conducts some instruction with them every day for about 30 minutes, and then she remains in the classroom throughout the day to sort of be the language resource in the classroom. But she's actually rarely called upon to do that, which I'll get into in a moment. Okay, so what's going on in Jane's kindergarten? To understand this, I focused on the morning meeting as a sort of baseline, and you all have a handout that describes the morning meeting in more detail, which I'll get to in a second. So morning meeting is really the only time of day that Jane actually holds the floor as a language instructor. So it's 30 minutes long, and these 30 minutes are Jane's sole opportunity for direct Ojibwe language instruction. She takes it seriously. So typically, morning meeting as a practice comes out of a responsive classroom philosophy. Its format is supposed to provide the predictability of routine while still allowing for daily variation. So these are the 4 sequential components that comprise an ideal morning meeting from this responsive classroom. Jane's class deviated a bit from this, and you can see what her morning meeting looked like on your handout. But remember, she's not just trying to set the tone for the day. She's actually trying to grow language in 30 minutes. So here's what her morning meeting looked like. And I've tried to pair it with the elements, the 4 basic elements, so you can see how it works. I'm starting with this for a couple reasons. I think it's helpful to see how scripted Ojibwe language instruction is in this class. Very few elements of this morning meeting involve free-form communication of student-originated ideational content. So this closely mimics those IRE sequences in similar contexts, like the Casca classroom that I talked about earlier. I'm also showing this to you because the morning meeting's routines are so very fixed and scripted that seemingly anyone can do it. I first noticed this on a day that Jane was absent from class. The full-time student teacher, Miss Tanya, took over the meeting because Jane wasn't there. And Miss Tanya is a white monolingual teacher. She's got no background in the language, and she seemed to elicit quite a bit of Ojibwe. So I had several chances to try my own hand at morning meeting later in the month when Jane was absent again. And so I used the data from Tanya's morning meeting and Jane's morning meeting and my morning meeting to see how necessary the teacher really is. So can anyone do it? Okay, so these categories listed on the far left column represent aggregates of my initial descriptive coding scheme. I wanted to compare how 3 different sets of knowledge or expertise played out in a sort of baseline counting of language tokens. So recall that Tanya is a student teacher. She's got nearly 4 years of formal training in elementary pedagogy. She's been with the kids since January, every day. She's not a community member nor a language expert. Mel, me, I'm not a community member, although I do have decades of experience learning languages, and I've taught languages, and I also have 3 years of Ojibwe language learning and a master's degree in applied linguistics. So I wondered if my counts would be different from Tanya's. And then Jane has little formal training in language or teaching, but she's a community member. She's been with those kids since their first day of school. She's taught many of the kindergartners' older siblings. She knows a lot of the kindergartners' families. She has 2 grandsons in the class. So does language look different across these 3 expertises? So here's an accounting of language for a prototypical meeting with Miss Jane. And these are just tokens. We can talk about that more a little later. On a representative day, here's an accounting of language when Miss Tanya ran the morning meeting. And then here's mine. I'll give you a chance to look at that. So this is a linguistic ethnography. I'm not running statistical tests to show which values are significant. This is only to orient you to the affordances that the morning meeting structure gives us. So Tanya's got no Ojibwe language. Her Ojibwe-only utterances attest to this, 17 in 30 minutes. Yet she's still able to elicit Ojibwe from the kids through use of nonverbal prompts and images on the visual aids that Jane had already prepared. still Jane is able to elicit twice as much. So if you look at, so here's what Tanya got the kids to produce. Here's what Jane got the kids to produce. So I would say the person delivering the morning meeting does make a difference. And because of the self-selecting audience here, I anticipated you guys all sort of having some interest in classroom talk. I want to draw your attention to, wait, here it is, to these numbers. This is the matrix language framed utterances for Tanya and Jane and myself. Remember, Jane and I have more language training than Tanya, or more language knowledge than Tanya, but we're still learners. So the more we try to increase the quantity and variety of Ojibwe language, the more likely we are to attempt things beyond our proficiency thresholds. So because of the demands inherent in real-time communication in languages that we're not totally comfortable in yet, we rely on English language to frame Ojibwe. And this is an issue that's not unfamiliar to educators and researchers in Indigenous language reclamation contexts. We know from work by Meek and Messing that this is common practice in other English-dominant school settings where Indigenous languages are taught as secondary subjects. And we also know from previous research on this kind of setting that matrix language framing tends to shut down Indigenous language use. Yet for Jane, the matrix language frame seems to function as a helpful scaffold sometimes. It sort of opens up a foothold that inevitably allows language users to reclaim interactive and conversational spaces for Ojibwe. The flexibility that Jane draws on throughout her day as a push-in language resource results in learners choosing to use Ojibwe when English should be the default. And it allows Jane to work around pedagogical constraints. They use their language in ways that are creative and experimental, and these kids use their language in ways that do things like express ideational content, display expertise, and relate to others. So I want to share some examples of this with you, but first I need to introduce a pedagogical constraint. So once the morning meeting is over, Jane takes on more of a supporting role in the classroom. So the students are divided into groups and they're sent to different tables throughout the room that are centers. Jane is usually stationed at one of the centers to facilitate an activity that's been envisioned by the classroom teacher. She rarely has any time to prepare. She just sort of directed to a station and there she is running that station. So Jane has to find ways to be flexible within not only linguistic constraints, but also these pedagogical constraints. Constraints like this worksheet that was used at a center on May 5th, because it was Cinco de Mayo. Okay, so the task given to learners with this worksheet is to come up with words in English that begin with each of the letters that comprise the Spanish words Cinco de Mayo. This is not contextualized for the students beyond the literal meaning of cinco in Spanish means 5, and today's May 5th. So the only scaffold was they got this worksheet, and then there was a whiteboard upon which the classroom teacher had written the same vertical Cinco de Mayo and then some sample words that they might want to copy down. So I realize this is not an ideal activity for these Anishinaabe emergent bilingual readers. However, a critique of instructional practices of the English-dominant classroom teacher are outside the scope of this study as they are outside the realm of Jane's control. So this is simply, I'm treating this as a condition of the classroom that she has to deal with, and it's a pedagogical constraint. So activities like this that amount to little more than a copying task, they seem like another mechanism for shutting down creative non-English language use. Yet Jane finds a way to bring flexibility to it. Okey-doke. So I'm going to show you some excerpts of how the class, or how Jane and her learners at her center, so there's only 3 or 4 of them at a time, how they sort of learn to work around this pedagogical constraint. So in the first excerpt, Jane isn't there yet. She was in a meeting or something. So I was running the Cinco de Mayo Worksheet Center by myself until she arrived. And so here is me, and then some of the learners. Here's Marco, and then 3 others. We're all just sitting around a table looking at the worksheet. So in line 448, I'm helping one of the students choose a word that starts with the letter N in cinco, so she can write it in that N space when Marco interrupts. So I say, you want to write not or net? N. So write your N first, and she writes it. And I say, that's a good one. E. And then Marco interrupts with Gaja Gaines. I say, Gaja Gaines. I look at his paper. Yeah, you wrote Gaja Gaines. Gaja Gaines. So This excerpt, I'm showing you this because I think it shows how the matrix language frame might allow for a bit more permeability in the boundaries that typically exist across content areas than we would have expected. What Marco actually wrote was the English word cat, but he's been taught through repetition and the boards that during morning meeting that gajigains is the Ojibwe word for cat. So to write the word cat and then read it aloud to a teacher as gajigains, it indicates a certain expectation of legitimacy of bilingualism in this space. And the fact that positive feedback follows and the English word cat is not used once in this whole thing. It may even afford Ojibwe a more legitimate position. So at least in this moment, it's legitimate. And this is far from that morning meeting and far from the carpet. Okay, so a short time later, Jane arrives. We fill her in on the task, and she takes over, trying to elicit some I words from the kids. Okay, so she's looking for I words. And Aries, who happens to be Jane's grandson, so this is a new group now. Jane's come in, that last group left, it's been 20 minutes, new group comes in. Here's the whiteboard, you can barely see it, but we're allowed to write on the whiteboard as a scaffold. Here's Alice, Gemma, and Aries. And Aries is Jane's grandson. So Aries tries to stay within the thematic content of Cinco de Mayo, so he suggests idios, or idios. Jane starts laughing and she says, that starts with an A. Okay, we have a few words here. She looks over to the whiteboard. She's reading the words that the teacher has written on the whiteboard in advance. Indigo, that's a blue color. Iguana, and then Alice gets out of her chair to hug her. There's lots of hugging and touching. Jane says, who knows what iguana is? And Gemma says, iguanaquud? And so she's, I think, trying to say ninguanaquud. And Jane kind of laughs, and I say, ooh, we can do that for N. That's a good one. Jane says, yeah. Do you want to do an Ojibwe word or an English word? As if this is suddenly an option now. And Aries says, English word. She says, okay, let's think about something that starts with I. Gemma tries again with itchy money do, which probably is kitchy money do. And Jane says, itchy money do? And I'm like, did she say itchy money do? We're smiling at each other. And Jane says, how about something that starts with I? So Jane catches on right away with what Aries is doing, and she kind of corrects the spelling and suggests some English language I words, but Gemma wants to do it in Ojibwe. And so in lines 86 and 95, she suggests inguanaquud and itchy money do. She's dropping the first consonants for the word she knows, ninguanaquud and gitchy money do, and she's highlighting those beginning short I sounds. Gemma's suggestions come straight from the morning meeting, during which time the class always discusses the weather and says a prayer, which you'll see in your handout. So Gemma's bringing Jane's words back to her in a sort of experimentation that tests her phonetic understanding and her emerging language, as well as new conditions for usage. So the flexibility around Jane, even within this matrix frame, not only allows the learners to explore what they think they know within their developing worlds as bilingual Anishinaabe kids and emergent readers, but it also shows Jane how they're understanding the language that is seemingly only reserved for this specific time and place. Note how Jane offers to help them come up with Ojibwe language I words in line 92. She presents English and Ojibwe as equally valued in the task. And I think that the flexibility that Jane brings to all language within this dominant frame encourages experimentation across literacies and modalities. These kids are experimenting with their emerging phonological understandings of both languages in a single supposedly English dominant activity. Okay, so here's some more. So the activity goes on, same kids, Alice, Gemma, Aries. I'm over here. Here's Jane. There's the board. We're still looking for I words. And so I've showed you some experimentation, but we still haven't seen any learner-learner communication. So this could be due in large part to the nature of the task. It's an individual writing task, and even though Jane has involved a lot of brainstorming and experimentation in the task, she's the primary interlocutor for all of this. And in fact, this whole activity kind of mimics an extended IRE sequence, even though it's a little more playful. Still, these kids want to talk to each other, and they want to do it in Ojibwe. So here we go in line, change the numbers. Okay, so Jane starts by providing some sort of metalinguistic comment, or some commentary with some metalinguistic translation. Ice cream in Ojibwe. You want to know the word for ice cream? It's daycog. Aries says, I love daycog. I say, me too. And just as we're talking about daycog, Kevin, another kid who also happens to be Jane's other grandson, moves through the space to grab an eraser and comes back out. And as he leaves, Aries says, hey, Kevin, I like daycog. So Jane's just talking. At this point, she's providing some commentary, but she's not trying to elicit anything. She's not demanding a response or any sort of indication that her message has been received. Nevertheless, Aries picks up on it and immediately provides his own commentary, responding to Jane's talk as if they're in conversation, as if they're visiting rather than engaged in this sort of IRE-based display of linguistic knowledge. And I chime in with my agreement. I mean, DACOG is good. I like it too. Just as Kevin moves through the space, Aries sees him and essentially invites him to join the conversation when Aries calls him by name and then opens with, I like DACOG. Moreover, DACOG is not a word from morning meeting. This is based on Aries' based upon Aries' willingness to use it in an English language frame after hearing it just one time. It's possible he's heard and used that word before, maybe even with Jane or Kevin. But so it's not a morning meeting word. And while the dominance of the matrix language is evident in the syntactic structure onto which DACOG is mapped, the fact that it's done at all and that Aries does it to a classmate who's actually his cousin, it shows that there's potential here for practices and performances of flexible languaging even within these pedagogical and linguistic constraints. DACOG is marked, but that may very well be the whole point of this performance of alternate Anishinaabe voice in an English language space. So by the time the group has reached O in Cinco, Jane has sort of turned this copying activity into an exploration of the kids' lexical repertoires in Ojibwe. She's asking specifically for Ojibwe words, something that's perhaps more metalinguistically clear to the adults than the kids. But they continue to participate enthusiastically, which shows how comfortable they are orienting to their languages and to one another as they're trying to make sense of the phonics at play here. So if we look at this, we're looking for O words. Jane says, any Ojibwe words that start with O? Aries says, Oza. I'm like, any what? Gemma says, ocean, but Aries kind of overlaps and says, Ozawa. Jane smiles, Ozawa, good job. And Aries says, wait, let's do Owen. Owen. I say, do you know somebody named Owen? Yeah. I say, well, I like Ozawa. And Jane says, Ozawa, I love it. Aries says, I like Owen. Owen. So the kids are connecting sounds with letters correctly. This is great. Jane and I are excited. And then suddenly Aries brings up Ozawa. This is a word from morning meeting. This is great. And then Aries changes his mind. He wants Owen. And it's clear that while he may demonstrate a playful orientation to his Anishinaabe language, it's his orientation to people and relationships that are most salient. He's not just bringing alternative voices into the activity. He's bringing social relationships and social histories. I mean, I tell him, I like Ozawa. Jane tells him she loves Ozawa. But Aries is resolute. He likes Owen, and that's what he writes on his paper. So I understand that matrix language framing is indeed problematic for its ability to strip the marked language of its power. This is particularly insidious in language reclamation contexts. So it's significant to see a teacher-learner like Jane find ways to leverage that matrix language as a temporary scaffold for herself and her learners. It helps them experiment and play, and she's actually legitimizing Ojibwe in the space. So this becomes a point of entree for alternative literacies, voices, and histories. Now, the morning meeting is far more scripted than this informal brainstorming that Jane facilitated around the worksheet activity. So Jane draws on similar familiar participant structures from the morning meeting and all the languages in her repertoire to bring familiar structure to the highly constraining activity. But rather than eliciting scripted talk, it's actually yielding linguistic flexibility, experimentation, and play. So Paradise and Rogoff talk about informal learning as involving tremendous vitality, flexibility, and effectiveness. When Jane is off script, her use of English affords her a flexibility that gives her learners a chance to explore what they know, and then they can relate it to other things they're learning, like phonics, or relate it to other things they care about, like ice cream and Owen. And so informality here, rather than a deficit, serves Jane well. Her life as a language learner, user, and educator are born of informal learning. And though this informality is really a source of anxiety for her, it's also one of her strengths. So I want to show you one more example. By the time the kids get to the A in Mayo, they've remade the activity into a group brainstorming session around lexical and phonological knowledge of Ojibwe. So here we see Aries asking, how do you say apple in Ojibwe? He knows that's an A word. I say Mishiman? I'm not quite sure. I look at Jane. And then Aries says, oh, Aries, Aries, Aries. Jane says, oh, yeah, Aries. That's a great A word. She says, all right, I'm going to write it up here on the board. And I say, that's an Ojibwe A word. Jane says animush, which is a previous contribution from another student. She writes animush, Aries. And I say, what else? And Jane says, another A word in Ojibwe. She's ready for more. So Aries has no trouble understanding how one thing can be called different ways in different languages. But he's still testing what overlaps and what doesn't. You know, apple's an A word in English. Is apple also an A word in Ojibwe? But before he can get too deep into how to say apple in Ojibwe, he realizes he knows another word that starts with A, his name. So Jane not only validates the phonology and orthography of Aries' A suggestion, but then she legitimizes the Ojibwe-ness of this suggestion by writing it on the board alongside Animosh. This is about more than language at this point. This is like an existential concern in this classroom. Historically, Aries is the name of a Greek god of war. Yes, it also happens to be the name that Aries' Ojibwe mother gave to him. And the naming does not make Aries more Greek. Rather, its association with Aries, the person, now inscribes Ojibwe-ness into this name for this person in this place. So Jane writes Aries on the board, not because it's a word from morning meeting or because it follows rules of Ojibwe phonology or orthography. It's because Aries' existence makes this an Ojibwe word. Okay, so briefly, so Bakhtin employs heteroglossia to describe the multi-voicedness of prose writing, because in prose, as in speech, no word is neutral. Words only and always exist in tension between the system of speaking, language or code, and the power of the context to shape the meaning. So he characterizes this tension as centrifugal force that seeks to whirl language apart into diversity, and then also centripetal force, which sort of keeps language on its same circular path toward normalization and standards. So heteroglossia is this social construction that allows speakers to absorb the voices of others, as well as question the authoritative as they continually remake language through their creative use of it. And the examples that I show you here, and then there's more from my dissertation, they offer an extended view of heteroglossia that describes the tensions inherent in the classroom as a context for language use and learning. Just as a heteroglossic approach to language views each utterance as weighted with its previous utterances, so are contexts, particularly institutions, and the practices therein weighted with their previous uses. So the extra-linguistic features of a context or institution or school, such as organization, hierarchies, practices, and associated beliefs and ideologies, they have made and remade it throughout history. They're significant to the institution's current incarnation. They're a part of the classroom ecology in which we're trying to grow a language, and so they warrant attention concomitant with applied linguistics' focus on the word and the code. So Jane's strategy of modifying this English monolingual copying activity into an interactive formative assessment of learner language shows how informality and flexibility are resources for a teacher-learner, along with scaffolds and tools such as routines and the use of the matrix language frame. Yet informality in a classroom setting also has the ability to kind of bind the teacher-learner in a position of impotence, whereby she's neither aligned with the preferred, more legitimate practices of school, nor fully committed to the relational orientations that support processes and relationships rather than products. So this bind has the potential to reject learner engagement that comes through the academically preferred channels, as well as learner engagement that seeks personal connections and attempts to bring what is outside the classroom in. Jane experiences this bind on a relatively regular basis as the person who's expected to grow proficient Ojibwe language speakers while serving as a push-in language resource in a colonial English dominant setting. Fortunately, Jane focuses on more than linguistic code as content in her teaching practice. Her handling of linguistic, ideological, and cultural binds and tensions provide insights into the kinds of expertise that teacher-learners actually wield. And a better understanding of the unexpected expertise of the teacher-learner is really essential to the existential nature of language reclamation in classroom contexts. This can have positive implications for the creation of curricular materials that offer educators greater flexibility, and it also forces the field of applied linguistics to consider research engagements that allow language objectives to dialogue with the local ecology that's inclusive of overlapping settler colonial histories and Indigenous futures. Okay, that's it. Miigwech. Thank you for coming. We have time for questions? Yeah? Okay. Would you like to ask a question? Anyone? Carter.
I was wondering, it seemed like a spontaneous addition or switch to Ojibwe on top. Did anybody consider it to be that part of the English language lesson was missing, or is it just everybody was happy that more Ojibwe was taken?
Oh, you mean like in this activity?
Yes.
So I think by this time, this is near the end of the school year, there were some other issues in that classroom that maybe I would say that this activity was maybe more of a time filler. So it was more like whatever happens in these 2 hours that we're running these centers, we just want everyone to sort of stay on task and not hurt themselves. So it was more like it was great that like there was bilingual stuff happening there. It wasn't the intention, but it also didn't like go against some sort of like English.
Purely additive.
Yeah.
Take away
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jen.
Mel, do you have some sense of what the classroom teachers' token use of Ojibwe might be if you have to think back over the day?
Yeah, so the classroom teacher was similar to Tanya. So so when I was showing you guys all this stuff, those numbers of us, that's really only from morning meeting because that's the only time that was like a set sort of 30-minute time period, and the structure was really set, so it was an easier way to count. Throughout the day, though, so the classroom teacher, she is Anishinaabe, but her language, I mean, I think she has some speakers in her family, but she doesn't really use it. And in the classroom, the only time I ever heard her use Ojibwe was when she chastised a student for like making a joke about Ojibwe. And then sometimes they would use sort of set phrases like Namadubin if they wanted someone to sit down, or Bizanian if they wanted someone to be quiet. But she was pretty English all the time. Yeah, Tara.
I'm just looking at this now, and I'm finding it really interesting to see that the kids are attempting Ojibwe more frequently with Jane.
Yeah.
I find that not surprising, but fun.
Yeah.
Because they're associating her with the Ojibwe language
Yeah.
as an Ojibwe person. That's interesting. I don't know if that's going to play out elsewhere in their data, or if you're going to be looking at language this way elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I find that's interesting.
Yeah, they talked the most with her, and they tried the most. It was very low stakes with her. And what I think is happening is the way that the classroom is set up, where she's a push-in language resource, it ends up really resembling families with bilingual language policies, where there's one parent, one language policy, where the learners, like I think Jane's presence even would affect whether learners attempted Ojibwe or not. Like if she's standing close by, they would be more likely, and it's often just one word crammed into an English matrix frame, but they would just try it more if she were there. And they a little bit when I was there, because I think they associated me with her. I was like her giant minion, but like they didn't do that as much with the English teachers. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what a matrix language frame is? I'm not used to that.
Yeah, so this is something that comes, I got it from Meek and Messing, talk about it in terms of curriculum materials. And basically, English is the dominant language, so it's sort of the matrix language. It kind of, it dominates everything. And so when we use English as like a frame for the non-dominant language, that sort of makes the non-dominant language marked, but it also then kind of constrains how we can interpret that non-dominant language that's in there. So like I like DACOG. It's like the syntactic structure is very English. I, like, and then the object. And it's just sort of, DACOG is just stuck in there. Yeah.
How unique was this, this kind of code matching and this particular activity that you pulled out?
So this is actually really representative. I pulled it out because I liked it because it shows a whole sequence of how Jane shifts. Like you see her starting to conduct it in English like she thinks she's supposed to, and then shifting once she realizes it can go other places. But this is really representative of what happened after morning meeting. It was usually 2 hours of centers, and wherever Jane was, she would try to figure out a way to work Ojibwe into it. But it was always like in the moment. And this is the student language that I'm showing you. That's pretty much how they used Ojibwe regularly when they were around Jane. Otherwise, they didn't use it that much. Anyone else? Jenna.
Talk about how kids are kindergarten.
Yeah.
So they're pulling a lot of their Ojibwe language from morning meeting and from in-moment interaction.
Yes. Yeah.
So do they ever bring, are any of them, do they have siblings maybe or family members who speak Ojibwe with them, who are bringing in their own references? Like,
Yep. So I haven't seen any instances of that where a student has brought in language that wasn't familiar from morning meeting. But I know, Jane knows these families, and so she's told me, like, I know their grandma, that kid's grandma, we mess with that grandma sometimes, we talk Ojibwe. So like they hear it, but it's they don't hear it, it's not often spoken to them. It's the kind of thing where they might walk into a room where adults are using it, and then the adults might switch when they see the kids come in, or the adults might only use it in like for certain uses, like for ceremony, for prayer, or to a similar matrix language frame. They might throw Ojibwe words in here and there, but maybe not like communicate with one another even in Ojibwe.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So you said that there's no profile of the teacher learner, right? And so for Jane,
Yeah.
as in terms of her kind of living through Ojibwe and she's continuing to learn
Yeah.
and grow her own Ojibwe, what do you know what her kind of communities are?
Yeah, so she grew up hearing it in the house, like her dad spoke it. But again, if she came in the room, he'd switch to English because he wanted her to have good English. She would ask him later in life, when she started doing like Ojibwe language education, she would ask him, like, teach me things, tell me things. How do you say this? How do you say this? And he would sometimes tell her, sometimes he'd mess with her and tell her the wrong thing so that she'd say it in front of one of his buddies and then everybody would make fun of her. But so currently she all the teachers know each other, and so she knows who the teachers are, and she doesn't use it to communicate very often either in her own life. I mean, her kids know some of it. She lives with some of her kids and some of her grandkids, and they all know some, but it's not a language that's used for communication too much, like for interpersonal everyday communication. Even within her, like with her friend group and stuff.
I ask because I wonder, and I don't know with 5-year-olds how much of this would spur language learning,
Mhm.
but when there's discourse happening in the classroom, like for instance, you had an example where you said like, oh, I think Apple is this, and you turned to her, and there was a learning moment happening
Yeah.
across 3 learners.
Yeah.
And she knew it. But like, do you have examples in your data of her
Mhm.
learning language through the kids' request for language, or?
So I don't have examples of them necessarily teaching her anything where she is like learning a new condition of use or a new word. But I definitely have more examples of maybe she and I, because of a learner question, she and I sort of like talking aloud through what we know and coming to like a new understanding of what something means. And we've even like gone up to get the dictionary, so the kids see us like, go get the dictionary and figuring it out. But that's also like another like mixed, like it's a bilingual interaction. It's not all in Ojibwe either. Yeah, Tara.
I'm fascinated by the fact that you were the one that were able to get them to use the most Ojibwe, right, kids. So one thing, it says something for language teacher development.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, but actually I'm curious as to how would you explain that? You're closer to the data, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting, right?
Mhm.
That Tanya
Mm-hmm.
clearly did not have the ability to
Yeah.
elicit language. Jane, that's her role. But how would what insights can you bring to the difference between your ability to elicit the Ojibwe with the kids and Jane?
Yeah, so first I would point out that like there is not a lot of rigor in this sample. This is a like video transcription, me counting tokens in 30 minutes on a video. So I want to first of all take a step back and say like this isn't necessarily how I would teach all the time. This is like I did 2 meetings, Tanya did 1, and Jane did a whole lot. But I was kind of not surprised because I really I'm in an Ojibwe language class. I'm trying all the time. I would try to talk Ojibwe to myself on my way to the site. I wanted to use it all the time. I was so careful about trying to stay in the language the whole time because I have a degree in applied linguistics. I know about I've read about immersion context. I know how to use target language as much as possible. So this didn't surprise me too much, and I actually think our numbers are pretty similar overall in terms of, I talked more in general. I guess maybe she talked more in English too. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not surprised too much that I elicited a lot, because I was trying to, like, it was really intentional based on all of my applied linguistics schooling, you know. And that's why I think it's really interesting how Jane also does other things. Like the token counts are one thing, but she does other things. Like she cultivates these like relational, these relationships, and she sort of shifts orientation to the language and legitimates the language when I don't know how to do that. I'm no one's grandma in that classroom. Yeah. Jenna.
I was thinking about that too. I think maybe what you're looking at to show in terms of like reference within the table, but the choices for what we see, right?
Yeah, I'm just counting here.
Chatty that day, but also how do we what counts as a nonverbal prompt and an understood nonverbal prompt between people who know my grandmother and you know or my own grandmother and me,
right?
Versus what
right.
I might see, you know. So
exactly. Yeah. This is just a jumping off point. And I actually was hoping to just use this to explore the structure of morning meeting. You know, it seems so very scripted and so structured. Like how much is that, like, is it a crutch or is it a scaffold? And this was sort of a way to help tease that apart. Any other questions? Iru. Oh, good.
I wonder if, because I'm also interested in why Jen used more English language only utterances than you, and I wonder if because one of the teaching and learning purposes set up at Jen is to get the meanings crossed out to students.
Just to get the what? Oh, the meaning?
Yeah. So like there's Baptine talk about like their meaning forms and context. So I wonder if the main purpose of her teaching and learning is to communicate meanings, but also do her best to also get the students to inform. And then so that's the one potential reason why Jen has higher number than yours.
Maybe. I can also tell you a more practical, like from being in these classrooms, even when I was leading morning meeting, I didn't feel like I was like the legitimate teacher in that space. And so I didn't do a lot of classroom management. I let the classroom teacher do that. When Jane's running morning meeting, she's in charge. And so there's a lot of just English of like, no, you sit down. No, I told you, no, don't touch him. Okay, you two need to switch. I mean, she's like moving kids around and she's doing a lot of English, just sort of like management that I just like chose not to do because I didn't feel like I could legitimately tell these children like what to do with their bodies in that space. Which, I mean, dozens are in there, dozens of instances. But yes, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thanks for coming. Miigwech Piajaig.